So hi, my name is Lindsay Pageau. I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension's Harvest New York team. I'm an Ag Business Development Marketing Specialist, and today I'm the moderator for this presentation. And I'm the co-vice chair of the Sustainable and Regenerative Agriculture and Agritourism group for the Global Agritourism Network, along with the chair, Dave Gillespie. So today we're going to have a presentation that is put on by this group from GAN. And I'm happy to introduce Chadley Hollis, and he is from the Global Agritourism Network.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm serving as the first secretary for the Global Agritourism Network as we try to get this community of people off the ground. About 2 months ago, we launched GAN, and whether you found us here through GAN or through another way to register for this webinar, we do hope you'll join our effort. We've got almost 400 people involved in GAN just thus far, and from over about 70 countries. And so we've got a truly global effort of people made up of stakeholders from farmers to tour operators, researchers, government officials. Everybody's involved in this. Anyone who touches agritourism is involved with us. And yeah, so we're excited to be here. The Global Agritourism Network is made up of 11 different regions around the world, and we have regional chairs for each of those regions. And we've got several different auxiliary committees, one of which is this one. And so thank you for being here. And yeah, we're excited to listen to Cherise.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to, I just want to introduce myself as Lindsay has said, as chair of the Sustainable and Regenerative Agriculture and Agritourism Committee. It's proving to be quite busy, quite popular. And I'm really, really glad that we're starting off with this presentation today. So I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Cherise Addinsall, who's just came back from a tour all over Europe, including the FAO, and doing her presentations on this topic. And so she's an adjunct fellow of University of Sunshine Coast, member of the Australian Centre of the Pacific Islands Research. And this presentation is based on the outcomes of 2 critical participatory action research projects conducted in the Pacific Islands between 2018 to 2023, correct, Cherise?
Yes.
Yes, and it's funded by the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research through the University of Sunshine Coast and supported by the Australian Centre for Pacific Islands Research and European Development Fund. So the CPAR process is led by Indigenous Pacific Islanders, developed a definition, standards, criteria, and categories for regenerative agritourism, with a particular focus on protecting Indigenous land management knowledge systems, climate mitigation and adaptation, land sovereignty, decolonisation of land and food systems, and rural Indigenous livelihoods in the Pacific. So, all of that said, I shall leave this event to Cherise. So you have the screen, Cherise.
Ah, thank you. Thanks, David. Okay, let's hope that technology works for me today. So I'll just share my screen to start with. How are we going?
Looks good.
That's good. Okay. So good morning, everyone, or evening for our Pacific viewers. And thank you to those in different time zones that have resisted either going to sleep or having a sleep in today to listen to our presentation. I'll be joined today by some of my Pacific colleagues that will present after me. So I know for some countries in the Pacific, unfortunately, it's extremely late, but I'm assured that we're recording this and sharing it publicly, so you'll be able to watch it at a more suitable hour. So yes, my name's Dr. Cherise Addinsall. I wear many hats, as you can see by the slide here. All of these roles have a similar focus, which is research and capacity building to support livelihoods and self-determination of Indigenous people in the Pacific Islands. I'm presenting today on CPAR outcomes from 2 projects from the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research that have led to practical outcomes such as a regenerative agritourism framework and the not-for-profit organisation Regenerative Vanua. So ACIAR works throughout the Indo-Pacific region to improve food security and reduce poverty among smallholder farmers and rural communities. In doing so, ACIAR contributes to their mission of improving livelihoods and making production systems more sustainable. So these projects were funded by ACIAR, as well as the University of Sunshine Coast, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, European Development Fund, and the Vanuatu government through the Vanuatu Bureau standards. It's also supported by colleagues from the Global Agritourism Network, the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, and the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance. So before I start, just on behalf of Regenerative Vanua, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Indigenous peoples of the large ocean states of the Pacific and their continuing connection to the Pacific Ocean, their lands, their cultures, and their communities. We also recognise their continuing struggle brought about from the impacts of climate change and pay respects to those that have lost access to their Vanua due to sea level rise or land alienation. So the CPAR process led by Indigenous Pacific Islanders developed a regenerative agritourism framework with working definitions, standards, criteria and categories for regenerative agritourism and regenerative Indigenous agritourism, with a particular focus on protecting and supporting Indigenous land management knowledge systems, climate mitigation and adaptation, land sovereignty and self-determination, decolonisation of land and food systems, and supporting rural Indigenous livelihoods and wellbeing in the Pacific. Regenerative Vanua was established as an outcome of the CPAR and formally registered as a not-for-profit in 2021. So Regenerative Vanua's mission is to build climate-smart, resilient, regenerative communities to support in the decolonisation and regeneration of Vanua. The vision is to restore pride in Indigenous food culture through regenerative agritourism and food tourism, regenerative farming and food systems, and regenerative landscapes. So Vanua is described as the land area one is identified with, which encompasses the people, their traditions and customs, their beliefs and values, and the various other institutions established for the sake of achieving harmony, solidarity, and prosperity within a particular social context. It provides a sense of identity and belonging. The Vanua is an extension of the concept of the self. This term is used in Vanuatu and Fiji, and throughout the Pacific, it has a different name, but the meaning is generally the same. So CPR methods were used to encourage participants to be active agents of change, rather than people that need emancipating. The decision to use CPR is based on its ethical foundations of inclusiveness and strong ideological underpinnings towards capacity building with a focus on empowering participants. This style of research is outcome orientated and seeks action and change if required, in addition to contributing to knowledge. This seeking action and change if required is an important consideration, as it's vital not to assume that participants want to change their circumstances or need assistance to do so. So with CPAR, it's important to reflect on positionality. I find this extremely difficult to do. I really don't like talking about myself in a presentation, but it's really important to explain where I'm coming from and acknowledge that it's made up of various intersecting social identities. These identities combined and their intersections shape how I understand and engage with my Australian Pacific colleagues and participants. So as an Australian-born, white, coloniser, settler, descendant of Irish and English immigrants, I find myself in a challenging and often confronting position throughout CPAR cycles in the Pacific. With awareness of the various systems that perpetuate inequity, I acknowledge the need to confront my privilege and to consider how I might take responsibility for naming and decoding our shared history. Further, as a white and otherwise socially, structurally, and institutionally privileged person, I critically reflect on how I've benefited from these histories. I see my role in the CPAR as mindfully listening to and taking the lead from my Indigenous colleagues. This is not a one-time declaration. It is an admission that I'll always be required to be on this journey of self-critical awareness, to ensure I'm aware of my privilege when working with my Indigenous Pacific colleagues. I also acknowledge I'm not just accountable to funding bodies or academic institutions that I work for. I'm also accountable to my Pacific colleagues and communities with whom I work. As a critical researcher, I recognise the expansive and transformative potential of learning, and I believe this exchange of learning has been really reciprocal. I'm emotionally connected to family, friends and colleagues in the Pacific. I've planted my roots in Vanuatu soil with my Indigenous Ni Vanuatu fiancé, and I know that I will always have one foot planted in my white settler history, and I acknowledge how this shapes who I am. So Vanuatu was used as the CPAR case study for this research. Vanuatu has a population of over 300,000 people. As you can see from the map here, it's located southwestern Pacific Ocean, 1,770 kilometres east of Australia. It achieved independence in 1980. It was formerly governed by the Anglo-French English. Okay. So the terrain ranges from rugged mountains, high plateaus to rolling hills, coastal terraces and offshore reefs. Most disaster-prone country in the world, it's highly susceptible to climate change impacts. Roughly 3/4 of the local Ni Vanuatu population live in rural areas, and it has the highest density of spoken languages in the world with over 100 dialects. Kava, beef, copra and timber and cocoa are the most important exports, and tourism and offshore financial services have had the highest contribution to GDP. However, leakage is a significant issue in these sectors. Most land is held under customary title and it cannot be sold to foreigners. There are, however, leases for up to 75 years. However, most leases have resulted in land alienation as the cost of reimbursement and development of land is unaffordable for most custom landholders. And Vanuatu, alongside PNG and the Solomons, is unique in that it's one of the last remaining places on Earth where Vanua and customs still outweighs the formal economy in measuring contribution to well-being. And there's some really interesting studies that have shown this. So what are the challenges that the CPAR sought to address? Increased urbanisation for jobs in tourism or leaving for RSE programs. This is the regional seasonal worker programs in Australia and New Zealand. Smallholder farmers are moving to monoculture farming systems from traditional diversified systems for export. These are consumption, and the consumption availability of diversified local fresh food is decreasing. High dependence on imported foods and soaring food import bills. This increased NCDs with over 20% of the adult population suffering with diabetes and over 2 amputations happening a week in Port Vila Hospital. There's increasing cyclones and reliance on imported staples, and tourism and agricultural development are contributing to land alienation and land tenure disputes and breakdown of social reciprocal systems. So some studies that were done prior to COVID and the border closures. So one is the Pacific Differentiation Study that was funded by New Zealand in 2019, and it sought to understand visitor perceptions of the Pacific. So the outcomes of this study showed that the key motivation for travelling to the Pacific was to rest and relax. What was particularly interesting, but also concerning, is the perception that Pacific is outside of culture or adventure tourism. The tourism was generally just all-inclusive resorts, and that the countries within the Pacific were generally the same. If you've been to one, you've been to them all. This is far from the truth. Another study was done prior to the border closures, and this is the International Visitor Survey, where Vanuatu's food was rated the least appealing factor to one's holiday. There were also complaints on social media from international visitors about Vanuatu's food being high priced, largely imported and bland, and suggesting it lacks culture. So food culture, it's the collective habits, rituals, beliefs, values, lifestyle and practices around producing and procuring and intaking food. It shapes the way people live and feel. It affects their identity and their culture. Food defines us and helps us form connections with our families, societies and countries at large. So we sought to ask, what has happened to Vanuatu's food culture? Why do tourists rate it so poorly? And why have local people lost pride in it? So our research reviewed the entry of agritourism into the Pacific, with multiple publications produced detailing the agritourism pathway from 2016. The first ever Pacific Community Agritourism Week was held at the Sofitel in Fiji in 2016. It was attended by farmers, chefs, resort managers, government officials, and national and regional representatives, and was described as a push to get more local food on plates in resorts and hotels and connecting farmers directly to purchasing managers in these resorts. This led to increased dialogue about agritourism in countries such as Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa, with momentum resulting in the formation of agritourism stakeholder groups, MOUs between government departments responsible for tourism and agriculture, and the development of agritourism forums and policy. However, reviews of policy implementation in the Pacific showed very little advancements on meeting these objectives. We also found this approach does not align with how tourism is described in the literature. This approach sees agritourism in the Pacific as reinforcing the ideas that tourism is all-inclusive resorts and tourism enclaves. This approach has nothing to do with diversification, and it's largely based on connecting farmers to resorts and hotels, not connecting farmers to tourists. So what's wrong with this approach? Addressing high import food in tourism, it's significantly important. However, it shouldn't be confused with agritourism. This is agribusiness. This issue is more aligned with slow food movement, gastronomy, localization, circular economy, etc. Our National Agritourism Coordinator, Ms. Vitasi McKenzie, you can see here in the photo, she stated, after a review of the approach to agritourism in the Pacific, we've found that we now need to address the key issue, which is the loss of pride in our own food culture and disconnect to our local food systems. We cannot put it on resorts, hotels, and restaurants to increase the use of local food if their customers are not seeking it out and our own people have shame in it. Therefore, we must raise the profile of our food culture so that they become attractions in their own right. We as Indigenous people should lead agritourism experiences of our traditional farming systems to build back connection and pride. This is where agritourism can have the greatest potential. So I've got a link here if technology doesn't fail me. It's a video from the Australian Broadcasting Commission.
When we were colonized, we tend to believe the foods coming in from outside is much better than our traditional food. And because of that mentality, a lot of our people feel like our traditional foods or vegetables or fruits and nuts are not as good for hotels and resorts. My name is Vitasi McKenzie, and my passion is promoting and use of traditional foods. My aha moment came when I was studying in Australia. So that was a long time ago. When I was studying in Australia, we were doing international cookery, and I was asked if I could showcase one of my Vanuatu cuisine dishes, and I struggled. That was the time when I was determined that, no, this is not good enough. It was too early for people to accept what I wanted to do. When I started the cafe in 1999, I had all this beautiful menu. And then to my realization, my people do not want to come to town to eat local food. They come to eat fish and chips and buy Cokes and blah, blah, blah. And I ended up with just expatriates coming to my cafe. That was hard for me, but that taught me we need to market this. I cannot do it alone, and the government also has to come in. So what I did was I focused on value adding. I did some nuts, and then I dried fruits, and then I went and did chutneys and jams and all these different products. And then from there, I took my products and go to hotels and resorts and tell them this is something that you can use for this. So that was the beginning of trying to introduce all these local products into their menus.
So next slide, thanks. Now we're using chefs from the resorts who are now unemployed.
My name's Cherise Addinsall. I'm a social researcher for the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. I've been working with that organisation now for 10 years in Fiji and Vanuatu. Vanuatu was actually listed by the World Bank as the 7th most dependent country in the world on tourism. So over 40% of its GDP. Very concentrated in areas, though, wasn't distributed throughout Vanuatu. And where those concentrated areas are is where we saw the most impact on culture, environment.
It was getting to the stage when a lot of our people in the last 40 years, they were so dependent on tourism. And once the tourist stops coming, They did not know what to do. So I think at this point in time, what we want to do is we want our own people to decide on what kind of tourism they want for their country. COVID in hindsight is a really good thing for us because we stop take of our lives and see where our lives is heading.
What COVID's done is people return to the land to cope without the income, and we have jumped on that. And it's really given us that momentum to change this story. So we're developing what we call agritourism experiences. Agritourism is not a niche form of tourism here. It's actually a sustainable management strategy. And it speaks to the core values of the people here, which is land, custom, culture, food, and community.
With this new agritourism strategy, definitely it is a new direction. We have 30 ambassadors that we're working with now. And what we wanted them to do is to go back to their businesses and to try to link it to agriculture, to their land, so that if agriculture can become their main source of income, when the borders are open, when they have visitors to their properties, to their farm, then that is the icing on the cake. But don't use it as your main income, because tourism is so volatile. When anything happens, you continue your life. We also have a good business that is running and that is operating, that is gaining income from the domestic market, because we cannot underestimate the domestic market.
We've got agritourism operators that are actually practicing their tours on school groups or government staff or local tourists. So, you know, there's a whole market here of people that want to go explore their own country. Now they've got a bit more time, they want to go see things.
But yesterday, we had a demonstration on the use of the local produce. People think, wow, it's so tedious. You have to spend so much time cooking this. So we try to come up with some new innovative ways of preparing in your modern kitchen and using local foods.
My name is Leonid Vusilai, but everywhere on Vanuatu, everyone calls me Leo now.
He is our winner for the first season for Pacific Island Food Revolution.
We made it up there because we brought our food culture with us. So every episode of the cooking competition, we try to tell a story of our culture through a plate. So we display the plate and then we try to talk about how it was used back then traditionally, but then we added our twist to it.
That has a lot of effect on people looking at that, wow, you know, this is great. I can do that too. I didn't realize that my food can be that nice. We are so proud of him and we're so happy to have him on board in promoting this revival of our foods. Every food that we grow in our garden has a meaning to it. We have our special dishes for different ceremonies for the whole life cycle, from the mother is pregnant, from when the mother is lactating, from when the child is born, and then the high school kids during initiation of boys and during menstruation. So the whole cycle of life, we have all these different foods that is grown. It is really diverse. It has so much story and tradition behind it. When the borders are open, we wanted international tourists to see Vanuatu as a traditional food, cuisine, and culture destination, that they will be able to come to Vanuatu to experience the natural organic foods that we have, which is unique and authentic. And I think this is something that we've been missing out on the last 40 years. And this is my dream, and I know that it's going to work.
Right, so a case study in Vanuatu. Prior to COVID, Mystery Island had the highest arrival number of cruise passengers in the outer islands of Vanuatu, up to 120 ships per year, and some of these ships had up to 6,000 passengers. However, the community also had the highest rates of NCDs. Alcohol abuse and domestic violence issues were so significant, the Paramount Chief banned alcohol consumption. Most food consumed came from outside the community. Minimal investment was made in infrastructure, medical centres or schools from tourism revenue, and it was a source of major disputes within the community, in addition to environmental impacts. However, during border closures, the chairman of the Unitarian Council of Chiefs, Chief Freddie Tamina, stated in the local paper, with the current restrictions of travel due to COVID-19, not only have our people returned to the land to plant gardens, but they've also built their own market house, and women are now selling fresh greens, and the men are harvesting sandalwood. The current lockdown has not affected our people. In fact, it has motivated them to tap into their resilience with a plan B. And this adaptive strategy has been described as a return to Vanua. So in the face of increasing impacts from climate change, communities' strength to adapt lies in their vanua and land sovereignty and their capacity for acting collectively with institutions, playing a pivotal role in reducing vulnerability to climate change. There is no one universal model, no specific instruction for implementation, no guaranteed methodological process that can be applied in every context, in every community. There must be constant collaboration, invention, review, and adaptation in order to develop frameworks that respond to the unique culture and ecology of the place in which regenerative agritourism is applied. Throughout the Pacific, it's the Vanua that shapes the regenerative agritourism framework. So until recently, agritourism has been focused mainly on economic outcomes in the literature. However, these debates surrounding authentic versus commercial, sustainable, regenerative, is agritourism political? Is it just primarily agricultural? Or is it a niche form of tourism? Commercial agritourism is described as disconnected from an authentic rural lifestyle, noting that it also produces environmental stress and influences further agricultural marginalisation. Agritourism, when implemented authentically, is described as a diversification strategy for disenfranchised smallholder farmers to support their livelihoods against a backdrop of increasing commercialisation and takeover of smallholder farming to big agribusiness and large-scale tourism developments. The decreasing income experienced by smallholders globally is a direct consequence of the commercialisation and industrialisation of agriculture and the expansion of large-scale agribusinesses, making it impossible for smallholders to compete. Smallholder farmers continue to make up the largest proportion of disadvantaged populations and typically experience higher rates of stress, depression, and suicide. Agroecology emerged as a framework that integrates science, practice and principles, and a social movement. And the movement strongly opposes corporate-driven agriculture that destroys social relations and nature. So in 2016, we applied agroecology to agritourism. And the agroecology and sustainable rural livelihoods framework relied heavily on community participation. It defined agroecological tourism as an ecologically and socially inclusive model of agritourism based on principles of sustainable tourism and agroecology. It now forms the core foundation for the regenerative agritourism framework. The aim of ecology as a social movement is to transform agriculture to build locally relevant food systems that strengthen the economic viability of rural areas. This involves supporting diverse forms of smallholder food production and family farming, farmers and rural communities, food sovereignty, local knowledge, social justice, local identity and culture, and Indigenous rights for seeds and breeds. There are political implications in applying it to agritourism, and that it seeks to challenge and transform power in society to move beyond corporate control of the food systems by making smallholder farming more viable and less susceptible to corporate takeover. We've now built on agroecology with regenerative. The term regenerative has since been added in recognition that work undertaken to develop an agritourism economy will need to take into account the rapidly increasing challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, decolonisation, human justice and fairness. It also provides a broader holistic mental context for consideration for agritourism issues. This regenerative perspective is slowly taking shape in the Western world and of direct relevance to the Pacific Islands region in its close match with existing Indigenous values and way of life. So through CPAR, we present a framework for regenerative agritourism, which has been designed, described and applied by Indigenous voices in the Pacific and facilitates the decolonisation and regeneration of Vanua. The regenerative agritourism framework encompasses the principles of regenerative agriculture and practice and agroecology as a social movement with political implications. Within the agricultural domain, comparisons have been made between regenerative agriculture and agroecology. However, it's less comparable when regenerative agriculture is proclaimed by larger corporates based on corporate sustainability approaches. Within recent regenerative development discourse, specifically regenerative tourism literature, there's increased reference to decolonial praxis, methodology, and projects. In an attempt to market destinations to global consumers, tourism has impacted the accessibility of Indigenous populations to their land, waters, food, and culture, either directly by blocking off access or overdeveloping leased land, or indirectly pricing out of areas. The regenerative agritourism framework uses the term decolonise within the context of repatriation of land and life and addressing land alienation. It uses the term as an active verb, not a metaphor. Regenerative agritourism is a tool for decolonisation in ways that large-scale tourism and agribusiness just cannot be, as it aims to disentangle tourism and agriculture from the patterns of resettlement and reoccupation and foreign domination and control. So in 2022, Regenerative Vanua, supported by ACIAR and the EDF 11 and the Vanuatu government, won an Island Innovation Award for piloting the agritourism program in Vanuatu. The agritourism program was developed in a way to support diversification and protect businesses and Indigenous near Vanuatu from the volatility and unpredictability of the tourism industry, which becomes significantly apparent during the border closures. Positive outcomes have led to increased disposable income, access to grants to transition to renewable energy, enhancing preservation of cultural knowledge, promoting more regenerative agricultural practices, and decreasing consumption of imported and low nutritional food. Regenerative Vanua have supported the adaptive strategy of returning to Vanua by building a thriving foods, tourism and agritourism sector and raising the profile of Vanuatu's cuisine and cultural food and farming heritage, which is empowering Indigenous near Vanuatu and restoring pride. The additional important outcomes of the CPAR is the changing perception that Vanuatu is experiencing in key tourism markets, from being seen as an all-inclusive rest and relaxed destination to an agritourism and food tourism experience destination that showcases local food, culture and meaningful engagement with Indigenous people in rural areas. A key benefit of this is agritourism is also attracting higher value tourists that are more motivated to venture outside of the condensed tourism areas to rural areas of Vanuatu. Also being rated in the top 7 places to visit in 2023 is invaluable marketing for the destination. So the GAN Leadership Committee have appointed Vanuatu to chair the Pacific Committee, and Regenerative Vanua will provide administrative support for the GAN Pacific Committee. Regenerative Vanua is also going to be working with the Global Agritourism Network Pacific Committee and every member country to contextualise the regenerative agritourism framework to suit their context and their Vanua. The aim of this approach is to allow for differentiation. So my Pacific colleagues have pre-recorded their presentation, which will follow on from mine. It details the impact of the CPR research and provides a more in-depth look into the regenerative agritourism framework, as well as the 3 categories for agritourism and the standards and criteria for these. If the internet's behaving, they will also be available to answer questions after their video. And I thank you for your time.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Good morning, wherever you're located. My name is Lorana Rakau Tokatake, and I'm the Operations Manager for Regenerative Vanua. I'm also here with my colleague, Ms. Nora Rihai, who's the Regenerative Agritourism and Traditional Agriculture Specialist. We're going to do a short overview of our organization, Regenerative Vanua. And before I start, I'd like to say thank you to the Global Agritourism Network for giving us this platform to present on our research and what we have been doing. And also I'd like to say thank you to our partners too. We've got the World Indigenous Tourism Alliance, the Global Agritourism Network, the University of Sunshine Coast in Australia. We've also got the Australian Centre for Pacific Islands Research, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, the Vanuatu Bureau of Standards, and the European Development Fund. So just a brief overview of Regenerative Vanua. Regenerative Vanua is a not-for-profit organization. Back in 2021 as a charitable organization under the Charitable Associations Act in Vanuatu, and we act as an organization responsible for research, training, product development for regenerative agritourism and food tourism, regenerative agriculture, and regenerative landscapes. Regenerative Vanua was established as an outcome of the Critical Participatory Action Research supported by ACIAR and the European Development Fund. Our mission is to build climate smart, resilient, regenerative communities to support in the decolonisation and regeneration of Vanua. And our vision is to restore pride in Indigenous food culture through regenerative agritourism and food tourism, regenerative farming and food systems, and regenerative landscapes. So just to introduce our team to you, we've got Mr. Jerry Spooner, who is our Executive Director. And we've also got Madame Votalsi McKenzie-Rowe. She's our Regenerative Agritourism Coordinator. We've also got Mr. Leonid Vusilai, who's our Local Cuisine Specialist, and Nora Rehai, who I've introduced previously to you. We've also got Dr. Cherise Addinsall, who's our Strategic Support and Mentor, and also Mr. Benson Samuels, who's the Chair of the Vanuatu Agritourism Association. The term Vanua, a lot of Pacific Island countries can relate to that term, including other different islands within Vanuatu. We probably spell it differently or pronounce it differently, but it all has the same meaning and we all connect to that same term. So in the Pacific, the concepts of personhood and land ownership are inseparable. And this is also the case for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and New Zealand Maori. So Vanua is key to our well-being. So prior to COVID-19 and border closures, many Indigenous New Vanuatu were leaving their Vanua and moving to the urban centers to work in the tourism industry, as Vanuatu was at one point listed as the 7th most tourism-dependent country in the world. During border closures, many of us returned back to our Vanua as a coping strategy, and also it was like our plan B. So without access to our Vanua, we do not have a plan B. And if we don't address alienation, land alienation and climate change, the next generations will not have access to their Vanua or plan B. So some might question why Vanua, and they probably ask whether it replaces sustainable. However, it doesn't. It builds on from sustainable. So we see enhancing well-being through adaptation to climate change as key to the regenerative movement. Regenerative is based on traditional knowledge systems and is better aligned to our Pacific values compared to sustainable. So if the well-being of people, communities, and land are improving, then it is regenerative. So just quoting one of our chiefs from Maigo Island, who's our Chief Freddie Wilson, he stated that if you benefited at the expense of anyone or anything, including future generations, you are not regenerative. It's more than just minimizing impact or only leaving footprints. It's about contributing to the regeneration of each other, places, and communities, or Vanua. So I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Ms. Nora. She's going to take on from here.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorana. So what then is regenerative agritourism? What does it look like for the Pacific? Regenerative agritourism is about our farmers and rural communities receiving visitors that are looking for indigenous agricultural and land management knowledge based on regenerative principles as part of seeking transformational and educational experiences. Everyone is familiar with sustainable tourism and sustainable agriculture or organic agriculture, which aims to minimize the damage caused from tourism or agriculture to the environment and our people. However, this is not enough. We are now in a climate crisis and our people will have to make sure that all activities they carry out on our land are adapted to climate change. Regenerative goes further than sustainable because it's not about minimizing, it's about improving the well-being of our communities, land, and ecosystems based on our traditional knowledge. Based on the work done with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations back in 2021, there was a call by FAO for a globally important agricultural heritage system. Vanuatu was one of those countries that put forward an application. Out of the 250 countries that applied, Vanuatu got accepted. It was within the 15 top selected countries with the water taro cadence or taro irrigation. We are now supporting the holders of these knowledge systems to develop regenerative agritourism experiences. Now, regenerative Vanua's interpretation of agritourism is that authentic agritourism is based on the specific concept of a touristic over on a working farm where the main livelihood activity should be generated through agriculture. It provides diversified income generating activities for small holder farmers where tourism is not a primary business, and with the criteria as you can see listed below. Regenerative Vanua's interpretation of regenerative agritourism is that regenerative agritourism is an ecologically and socially inclusive model of agritourism on authentic working farms that are practicing regenerative agriculture. Educational, interactive, and transformative experiences are delivered based on the interpretation of regenerative agroecosystems which support climate resilience. Experiences are not primarily for international visitors. The operator acts as a regenerative ambassador, tailoring experiences aimed at promoting regenerative agricultural practices and supporting positive behavior change, and connecting local youth, community, and domestic tourists to local farming and food systems. Regenerative Vanua's interpretation of regenerative indigenous agritourism is no different to the previous definition. It's just that this is meant for indigenous local, indigenous New Vanuatu's who are on a journey to decolonize using a regenerative Vanua. Regenerative agritourism categories, there are about 6 categories under regenerative agritourism, which each one has its own standards and criteria. The first one being regenerative agritourism pursues net positive and improved system capacity, incorporating sustainability measures. The second one is that regenerative agriculture and nature positive landscape practices. Third is animal welfare. And fourth is thriving places and communities. And fifth is regenerative transformational agritourism experiences. And last but not the least is regenerative transformative and healing journey.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk a bit on our core programs. So Regenerative Vanua has 4 core programs. The first one is Regenerative Agritourism Pathway Recognition Program. Then we've got the Regenerative Agritourism Product Development and Experiential Exchange Program. We've also got the Regenerative Traveler Loyalty Program. And lastly, the Climate Smart Regenerative Communities Program. This last program commences on the 1st of September this year. And it's funded by the Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research. We will be working in collaboration with the Department of Environment in Vanuatu, as well as Live and Learn Vanuatu, and supported by the University of Sunshine Coast. So just quoting the CEO of the Vanuatu Bureau of Standards, who we worked in collaboration with to develop the regenerative agritourism standards, she stated that we cannot compete on the mass platform. This is what VBS, or Vanuatu Bureau of Standards, stands for, focusing on niche areas such as regenerative agritourism. Standards and third-party verification are the only way forward to ensure quality, consistency, credibility in order to give reassurance to the market. Our commitment to support Regenerative Vanua as the third-party organization responsible for agritourism standards is reflected in our partnership agreements. Through this collaboration, we will ensure that certification is accessible to all of our Indigenous regenerative agritourism operators. If we want quality, consistency, and credibility, this is the way forward. It's been a long journey, but we're slowly getting there. So just to end off our presentation, Pacific Agritourism going forward, Regenerative Vanua, we will work with the Global Agritourism Network Pacific Committee and every member country to contextualize the standards to suit their context in Vanua. And the aim of this approach is also to allow for differentiation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure presenting to you all today.
Thank you.
Thank you.